the question of, are we alone or not in the universe? Are we being visited? Those are some of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves as human beings. And we might be on the very threshold of getting an answer to that. Why wouldn't that be interesting? Why wouldn't that be important? It is interesting. It is important. Lots of things going on right now. And that's why I think people should follow this story.
Greetings and welcome to the Vortex. I'm your host, Daniel Allen Jones, and I'm very honored to be here with Nick Pope. Nick, great to be here with you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We've had an excellent time here in Edinburg for the Out of This World UFO Festival and Conference. We just wrapped things up, and it's been an incredible time where people have been able to get together and learn about some of these fascinating subjects dealing with UFOs, aliens, strange encounters, and what the government might be hiding or revealing through this disclosure movement, this process that we're seeing. And this is something that you touched upon. You did a great job presenting, and I think it's important to see what we can glean from the highlights of what you talked about last night when we're dealing with what the government and military knows when it comes to UFOs, the history of this subject, and what we might be expecting when it comes to what's going on in the news. You made several news and media appearances. So when it comes to what we're looking forward to is disclosure, what can we see happening now that might affect our understanding of this subject?
Well, you're right. As America reopens and as in-person events come back, one thing that's abundantly clear is that there is huge public interest in UFOs and that this subject has transitioned from the fringe to the mainstream. So, for example, what we've got right now is a lot of mainstream news media coverage about the upcoming report from Director of National Intelligence to the Senate Intelligence Committee. This was requested in the Intelligence Authorization Act, and it's due to come by end of June, about June 25th. There are some rumors that it might be delayed. I wouldn't rule out it coming in on time or even early. With the government, one never knows. But the point is this is an unprecedented time, and a number of senior people, former CIA directors, former DNIs are now coming out with information about this, and suddenly the stigma's gone. It's okay to talk about this. And, we're talking about pilots, radar operators, seeing these things, tracking these things, forward-looking infrared camera footage. It's all happening.
Right, and so we can see that with many people's involvement, it seems to be reassuring that not only is this a legitimate, real phenomenon that's been acknowledged by the government, military, and the big Pentagon here in the US, but that other governments, other world nations have actually been working at investigating this closely as well. And with your involvement with the Ministry of Defense in the UK, how has it been with what you've done and what you see happening to help really this process worldwide, not just maybe in America, but do you think that we're just trying to get caught up with what other nations have done, or are we really trying to find a common ground to make sense of this as a world entirely?
Well, it's an interesting question, and yeah, absolutely, you're right. This is a global phenomenon. There are reports on all of this from all around the world. So it's not just the United States, it's the United Kingdom, it's Canada, it's France, it's Russia, it's China, it's all the South American countries, Africa, Asia, everyone has a stake in this. And I think there are differences. Obviously, some nations have active UFO programs and some don't. And some nations are a little bit more open with others about what they'll disclose about this. But, and many people say, of course, perhaps the United Nations or some similar body should take some sort of coordinating role. But yes, it's the height of arrogance for any one country to think that they've got a monopoly on this. They haven't. So I would say to anyone interested in this, yeah, sure, watch what's going on in the United States right now with the US Navy videos, the revelations about the Pentagon's ATIP program, the UAP task force set up in Office of Naval Intelligence, the classified briefings, the upcoming report from DNI to the Senate Intelligence Committee, all that. But don't don't think it's just happening in the United States. I mean, it really is happening all around the world.
Right. I think it's something that helps us see that, as you said, it's not just an isolated phenomenon. We have it everywhere. It's something that we might know about more in the States because of how social media works and the internet and a lot of media coverage, which focuses more on news here rather than what we might hear in other places in foreign news. But one of the things that I think is challenging for a lot of people is this idea that maybe because we're in the military and the government are approaching it from the angle that this could be a threat. And while that seems to be a reasonable assessment, considering that if you're looking to protect our airspace, our defense secrecy, all these things, it would make sense to address this in a way that we need to make sure that we're safe about it and not give people the wrong impression. What is your position on the idea that some people find or may dislike the notion that we could be dealing with a threatening phenomenon rather than it just being fun and peaceful like we see here at these festivals? Everyone's celebrating it, which is great, but we also have to think that there is something to this that we need to be very careful and serious about as well.
Well, again, a really interesting point, and yeah, we're all here in Edinburg, in the great state of Texas, for this wonderful UFO festival that we've just had, and it was great. We had everything. We had dancing robots, we had costume competitions for adults and for kids, we had laser shows, we had speakers. Everyone had great fun, and we should never forget there is a fun side to this, but there's a serious side too. And I mean, speaking as someone who's looked at this from within government, I would say yes, there is an equation that we use for a threat. And in military terms, threat is defined as capability times intent. Well, we know from some of the data that have recently been released by the US government and military that the capability is pretty darned impressive. What we really don't know is the intent. And there's an old saying that it's better to assume there's a threat and be relieved if it doesn't materialize than assume everything's going to be fine and then get caught with your pants down. And I quoted the old African proverb, speak softly but carry a big stick. Look, whatever we're dealing with here, nobody wants to start an interstellar war. Nobody wants any sort of hostile situation. But when you embed UFO programs, as most nations do, within the military, you get that mindset. Now, I think there is an argument, a compelling argument, to say that perhaps we should do what France does. They embed their UFO program within their space agency, and you get a different perspective. But I don't think any of us have got a monopoly on this, or a sort of, I'm right and you're wrong.
Right. I think it's something that we can see that it might challenge people's understanding of what life would be like for them to come here and be friendly or not. That can be something we see in movies and in Hollywood and all this pop culture that impresses upon us a certain notion that we should be very afraid or we should be welcoming. But this is actually a very serious thought. And being taken into consideration by high levels of people, very credible people throughout government and scientific institutions. I know you've taken part and have researched and have known about several different meetings that have taken place with credentialed people who have looked into this to say, okay, when we're considering other worlds and what life might be like in relation to our own, we need to prepare our society for the possibility that we not only are not alone, but that there are going to be many things that are going to challenge our belief systems, how we think about our world, technology, each other, how we interface and communicate, language, all of these things. So you've appeared on Ancient Aliens, you've been in a number of programs, and I'm sure you get asked all the time, people want to know, where are the aliens? Where are they, right? So when we talk about aliens, this is a really silly subject to some people, but you have to really consider what this is in a way that, science is trying to understand it, the government's trying to understand it, we as civilians are trying to think about what this could mean for us as well. But when it comes to the government's role, the military's role in all of this, announcing that UFOs are a real phenomenon is one thing. Where do we see this going if in the event that alien life were to be declared part of reality and part of not just something that is now happening, but maybe has been happening for decades, centuries, millennia, possibly going back throughout ancient times. Would we see a similar process of disseminating information through these outlets to get to the point of saying and making those declarations that yes, alien life is here? Or what might that be like if we get to the point of announcing extraterrestrial life?
Well, first of all, anything in our airspace is automatically considered a defense and national security issue. So again, I just want to clarify that point. But in relation to your question, yes, I mean, the question of the issue of disclosure fundamentally turns on the question of what is it that we have to disclose. And if it is literally a spaceship hidden away in a hangar somewhere at some Air Force base, then fine, I guess you could get to the point where you say, okay, let's tell people. But if it's something a little bit more nebulous and ambiguous, like, well, there's something in our skies, our pilots chase them, our radar operators track them, but we really don't have all the answers here, then it's a little bit more difficult. I mean, the UFO community talk about disclosure with a big D, and they imagine it to go something like this. The president has a live press conference one evening from the Oval Office at prime time. My fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. And that's great. And yeah, to follow that up, absolutely, every aspect of our lives would change. Politics, religion, science, technology, economics, the military, personal paradigm and worldview, everything would change.
Right.
And yet, we'd still have to go to work, we'd still have to buy groceries, we'd still have to get the kids educated. So it's one of these kind of bizarre situations that everything would change, and yet the flip side is that actually an awful lot would just have to carry on, because we'd have to. In terms of media management, government always talks in terms of key messages. So they would have key messages, calm people down, just don't, lead to a situation where people panic and run for the hills.
Right.
But really, ultimately, we should never lose sight of the fact that this is an events-led phenomenon. And we can only react to the events as they unfold. Now, look, if we're being visited, I hope that they're coming here not as exterminators or conquerors, but as anthropologists to study us, the biodiversity down here on Earth, the anthropological implications of emerging civilizations. And that's what I hope we're dealing with.
Absolutely. As a student of anthropology myself, that's actually something I'm very fascinated in, is to see how we can understand not just how other civilizations might manage their own societal abilities to enact upon what they can share with us, what we can learn about ourselves. And I think that's something that would be very insightful to learn, to be able to have that kind of connection, and of course a peaceful way to see what we can learn about the rest of the universe, and really kind of get an idea about what else is out there, what's going on. And so there's so much to this subject when we talk about ufology or disclosure and alien life. There's so much to it. It's multifaceted. But what would you say is the biggest takeaway, why it's important that we consider these things, what it might mean for us? You hit upon some really great things. Like you said, it can change so many different parts of our lives. The aspects might be different in some ways, but could stay the same. What would you say, or what is your position on why it's still important to consider studying this, to learn more about this subject, and what we can do to help advance our own life in our own world?
Well, I think it goes back to the anthropological argument that in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, there may be civilizations out there with millions, perhaps a couple of billion years head start on us. And what would they look like to us? What would their understanding of science and their technology look like? They would be perhaps indistinguishable from God. So let's we love these Hollywood sci-fi movies, but let's set them aside. We don't want to get into a shooting war with these people. It would be ridiculous. So, and two such civilizations, with a billion or 2 years head start on us, newly emerging civilizations like us might just be the last interesting thing in the cosmos. So I think that gives me hope that they would have solved all the problems, figured out all the physics, how the universe works, etc., etc. But life will still surprise and delight, and I hope we can do that. I went to a Royal Society discussion meeting back in 2010, and somebody said, when will the aliens make open contact? And a scientist shot back with the answer, when we do something interesting. And I thought that was great. I mean, there was a study out last year that said there might only be 36 civilizations in our galaxy. And I stopped for a moment and I did the math. And I figured that with some estimates of the number of galaxies in the universe, that would mean 72 trillion civilizations out there. So I'll round off with this to answer your question of why it's important. I think it's this. The question of, are we alone or not in the universe? Are we being visited? Those are some of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves as human beings. And we might be on the very threshold of getting an answer to that. Why wouldn't that be interesting? Why wouldn't that be important? It is interesting. It is important. Lots of things going on right now. And that's why I think people should follow this story.
Excellent. Well, Nick, you've done a great job in chronicling a lot of these things. You provide people, again, once again, just the reassurance that we can have in society that not only is this a real phenomenon, but that we can learn so much about our world, ourselves, and the rest of the universe, what's possible out there. And it's great to be able to have you bring forward this information and provide it in a way that's meaningful. It helps us think, and it provides hope for those who are eager to be able to see this in a constructive way that helps us on this trajectory of, a positive humanity rather than going. And like you said, if we have all these problems in the world, maybe there's something that we can learn from advanced civilizations to get beyond some of the obstacles that are keeping us from going out into the rest of the stars. So it's been wonderful to be able to see all the different contributions from your involvement from early on until now. It continues to be very insightful. So Nick, I appreciate your contribution here with us today.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you in the Vortex.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond. So let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.